knew that this was the place to be, that Toronto is the place where AI innovations happen. And if anything, I'll say that Toronto's status as an AI innovation leader has gone down since then.
Hello and welcome back to episode 7 of Not a Minimum Viable podcast. We're here to bring you conversations with the builders, founders, and entrepreneurs who are shipping way more than just MVPs in Toronto's tech ecosystem. Each episode will dive deep into their journeys, from those early minimum viable products to the full-scale solutions they're building. Today we're joined by Sid, an AI researcher and engineer who spent nearly 4 years scaling LLMs at Cohere and is now working on next-generation architectures at Runway. Beyond the technical work, he's passionate about filmmaking and has become something of a Toronto evangelist with his "you can just do machale" philosophy. Welcome to the podcast, Sid.
Thank you. Excited to do much.
We're excited to have you here. And like we were talking about just off mic before, you and I have never met before, but you've met Rudy before. So just from my perspective, I was curious to hear a bit of your intro as well. And if you could just brief us about your trajectory so far and where do we find you today?
Yeah, I mean, I grew up in India, lived most of my life in India, and then in 2020, I moved to Toronto to work at a biotech company. And I had been like involved in the AI research scene since like 2017. Yeah, so that's my AI journey. Like doing AI brought me to Toronto because I consider Toronto as the unofficial birthplace of AI. And then otherwise, like after moving to Toronto, I've like had the opportunity to finally kind of pursue like my interests outside of like computer science, I guess, which could be like photography, filmmaking, music. So it just gave me the space to at least at a surface level understand these things that I'm interested in, and and it brings me to this point. It's been 5.5 years in Toronto. Great run. Can't believe it's been that long. Uh, and yeah, I'm at Runway now and having fun in Toronto.
Yeah, that's pretty cool. So just to clarify, you spent almost 4 years at Cohere prior to this, during what was probably the most like intense period in AI history. Right when ChatGPT, Claude, this whole like LLM explosion was taking place. And you were co-leading, I guess, the training framework teams and the pre-training teams. You were known as Sid from, was it Sid from Foundations or Sid from pre-training?
Yeah, Citizen Foundations, yes.
There, yeah. What what was it like being inside one of those like key companies during that transformation that were sort of leading this charge into this new like AI space within the industry?
Yeah, I think at Cohere we started building LLMs before ChatGPT was a thing, before Anthropic was even a company. uh, it was it's interesting, like because like when we first started building at Cohere these LLMs, these were all just base models, and people now refer to like non-reasoning models as base models, but we're talking about the continuation style base models. And and we were trying to figure out, okay, now we have these base models, how do we make them useful? And then a bunch of things came up, few short prompting, and we were trying to teach people, okay, if you want to if you want to make this technology useful, show it a few examples of what you're looking for, and this model will do that. And then obviously, I think we had a hard time. We were basically trying to teach this to the world, right? A new paradigm, a new technology, and what does it even mean when to prompt a language model? So that wasn't a good product experience, and I think OpenAI did like an obvious thing, maybe obvious in retrospect, but when you look at it from a product point of view, it's really clear that hey, like we don't want, if this technology is going to be adopted by the world, the rest of the world, no one's going to take the time to learn how this works and how to few short prompt it. So the immediate product point of view is like, okay, we just need to get rid of that somehow, which brings us to like instruction alignment and all of that, and which Cohere, actually OpenAI gave a talk at Cohere talking about like instruct language models when OpenAI first released them. And then this obviously made sense to most of us at the company. Then ChatGPT came out shortly after that. Yeah, that really unlocked so many things. It made, I think most importantly, it made things much easier for Cohere. because people were so curious about how this technology works, because it's like magic the first time you interacted with it, right? You ask it to write an email or a story, it just does a pretty good job at that. And now you're wondering, okay, how did it do that? So that naturally led to people just being curious about this technology, which in turn made it easier for Cohere to sell this product. And then obviously iterate on that and get to a place where we have instruct language models as well. So it was wild to see all of that, like these paradigms shift constantly uh, over the 4 years, starting out with base models and then the instruct models, now the reasoning models, and even productionizing them and productizing them and worrying about the unit economics. It's kind of chaos every day when you're in it, because there are different market pressures and the valuations are exploding, and it is definitely hard to have some sense of mental clarity about where is this technology going? What does it mean for the financials of the company that you're at, whether that's Cohere, OpenAI, or whatever other company? And also, like the impact of this stuff, like how is the society gonna adopt that? And I don't think there's an obvious path to this technology being a force for good. I think we have to be very intentional about that. So yeah, all of these things, just like you have to be thinking about it, and you have no choice but to, because they're like kind of lingering. Uh, yeah. So I don't know if that answers your question, but excitement, chaos, and concerns. It's all mixed in. That's what I would describe it as.
Yeah, that's pretty interesting. It's interesting you brought up this idea of paradigm shifts because I was curious to know how did how did essentially being at the forefront in the middle of all these paradigm shifts sort of change the trajectory of the product while you were building it, as well as like your own, I guess, like mental perspective towards the product and how you were approaching it.
So yeah, like I said, base models were hard to sell, and even internal adoption. It's fun to kind of play with them, but it's really hard to see them as like a viable product that people are gonna pay to use and even find like usefulness in them. So yeah, when like the instruct paradigm came about, it was very clear that we needed to act on that, right? Because we're going to build something. And OpenAI had like a very good head start on like how do these techniques work, and not just that, but internal annotation infrastructure that they had. They had scientist involvement in these annotations. And a little bit of a segue here is like I think people in the field use this argument too many times, and not in a good way, where like, oh, you're gonna spend like annotating data for like 20 hours, maybe 20 hours in a month. That's not worth MLE time. That's not worth your scientist time because you get paid a lot more, and you could technically outsource these to, I guess, annotators and try to tell them, hey, like just solve this task for us, or just like create data for this. And I think that really, like as a scientist, you need to be thinking about what kind of data you're working with and what you're putting into the model, because the model is basically just picking up uh, patterns and reasoning from all of that. So, and I think that was a big part of the friction to move towards instruct language models, because it's really boring to just look at the data and manually annotate stuff and figure out, okay, maybe this data is bad, let's filter it out. And even getting a sense of data, no one wants to look at it because it's just like huge chunks of text, and it's really hard to even build filters for it and get a holistic understanding of what kind of data you're giving to the model at the instruct stage. So, and I think that slowed down the adoption or the move towards instruct language models a bit, not just at Cohere, but many other companies that I know. That level of carefulness that OpenAI envisioned, credit where credit's due, they've done a fantastic job there. I mean, they continue to innovate, of course, but you look at this paradigm and you kind of then really try to internalize, okay, what does it take to create these models and what does it take to really make them good? And then reinforcement learning came to the forefront, which wasn't a thing uh, during the base model era. And then people started, you know, thinking about, okay, how do we do RL on this? Uh, and So a bunch of innovations came about there, and yeah, it's just like you're just constantly like thinking about how to make this better. Because once the instruct paradigm came about, it's much easier to experiment with these models. Just ask them anything. And if they don't do a good job, then you know you have things to work on, whether that's coding or just like logical reasoning questions. And I mean, the strawberry question, like how many hours are there in strawberry? Even simple questions like these to get like a litmus test for, okay, how reliable is this technology and what are its failure modes? So you constantly just like work towards those, towards resolving those failure modes. And I think dog fooding is perhaps like the most important thing there. Just trying the things out. And these are all like I'm not saying that I actively did these things while I was working on building this technology, but I feel like I've learned so much in retrospect, looking back and say, okay, yeah, this makes sense, and this change was obvious, and I, yeah,
And you talked about initially how you have to keep a lot of things in mind even while you're building from the inside. You mentioned the financials and how the product might affect culture, society, and so on. So, are those things actively shaping the day-to-day direction your work is taking, or is it just something that you kind of have to keep in the back of your mind as somebody working on like the technical aspect, the science behind it? And I'm curious if the attention towards that changed at any point when the instruct models came about and you realized that there's like a different direction you may need to take with the work.
yeah, yeah. I think insert models were definitely like it immediately impacted how we build language models and what stages of training take what priority. And in terms of like how often do I think about these things, about the impact or whether that's financial or cultural, I would say just probably every day, especially at this point where there's something new coming out every day. And then your mind cannot stop but wonder, okay, what does it mean? Like there are so many nonlinear interactions between this technology and how it's going to impact, you know, uh, the rest of the world, that something new keeps coming up. People build these pipelines by just linking different pieces from different providers and build cool things. I think if you see Kriya, which is like a video generation company as well, they've just put together a bunch of models, and you can just like take it from one provider to another provider and like maybe even craft movies. So it's the day to day, like being in pre-training is it's very mechanical work. You're working with large scale GPU clusters or TPU clusters, and you're trying to get this model to converge. And so there are so many pieces that go into it. It's really an intersection of like machine learning and distributed systems. And I did not have any expertise in distributed systems when I first started doing this. So I had to kind of pick those skills up as time went along. So there is basically no time for you to think about the societal impacts early on, at least back in 2021 or 2022, because that vision and that conviction needs to be really strong. Some people had it that this technology was going to be something, everyone's going to be talking about. You just like go to a cafe and people are going to be talking about LLMs. And I did not have that kind of vision. I wasn't sure what this technology was going to become and if it was going to get there to the level of usefulness and reliability it has today. I still think it has a lot of failure modes, and I still think the hype is a little overblown and all of those things. But I was definitely like just having fun in the moment, not thinking that, okay, this is what I'm working towards. That is why I'm excited now. It's just fun to learn about distributed systems. It's just fun to build these large neural nets. And I just loved building neural nets. And I just wanted to keep doing that. And I didn't think about those. And these concerns about, okay, like now the VC interest is just like getting up there, and people are starting to adopt this technology. That came on much later. I want to say around 2023 is when I really started trying to extrapolate where this was going to go. So I was definitely a bit late in that regard.
So you say that you're doing all these things because you find them interesting, yet at the same time, I can't help but notice the timing of your moves. Like you joined Cohere right as like the transformer revolution was taken off.
Yeah.
Now you're at Runway right as video generation is becoming the next big thing. Like, Google had the big model release a couple of days ago.
Yeah.
Are you intentionally positioning yourself at these like inflection points, or do you just have good timing?
Uh, I definitely got lucky. It's a big part of it is luck. I'm not being humble here. You can twist that into something of that sort, but no. The co-founders of Cohere, Aiden and Ivan, I had been working with them since 2017, so it was a long time. And then this was at 4AI before Cohere Labs was a thing. Uh, it was 4AI, and it was like just a voluntary research group, and everyone was in Toronto, and that was my first connection to Toronto with people here. But yeah, I just wanted to work in AI, and then Cohere wasn't a thing back then, so I interviewed with this biotech company called Protein Cure, and they gave me a take-home assignment. So trying to solve that was like one of the most interesting things I've done in my career, I think. They gave me a really interesting problem, and I spent so many days on that just thinking about, okay, how do you even go about solving this? And so I just ended up in biotech, and I didn't think that I would leave biotech just after 1 year because the field was amazing. It's incredibly difficult, uh, and yeah, I think it's one of the most difficult problems right now. But at Protein Cure, I was towards the end of that year, I was the only machine learning person left in that team. And at the same time, Cohere, I mean, Aiden reached out saying, hey, like, hey, dude, we just started Cohere, you should join us. So I interviewed with them, and it went well, and I ended up joining. It wasn't because, oh, like, transformers are taking off, let's just do that. And obviously, like, when I was an undergrad, GPT came out, and I was working with RNNs at that point, and I saw the generations from the GPT model, and I was like, holy shit, this is amazing. Like, how is the model producing this very, very coherent text? So knowing that Cohere was building LLMs, it definitely contributed to why I made that move. Because let's look at how good these LLMs can get. But it wasn't with the vision that this was going to be what it is today. And even video gen, it's because we can talk about that a bit later, perhaps. But uh, after 4 years at Cohere, I knew I needed to change. And the change I was going to go for was either biotech or something closer to filmmaking. And and for filmmaking, I believe that there are very, very few companies, maybe two or three companies, that really do a good job at making the lives of artists easier or build with artists in mind, as opposed to treating them like commodities for like popularizing the tech that you're building. And I think Runway is one of them, which is why I joined them, not because I thought. I mean, I knew that video models were going to also get better because that kind of scaling is slowly being brought into the video space, but it is not the reason that I joined them. And I interviewed with a biotech company as well and had an offer from them, but I did not want to leave Toronto. So Runway was the only option left, and very exciting as well.
So at Runway, you're working on, I guess, next generation architectures in generative modeling. Without like giving away any trade secrets, what does that like really mean? And like for you, does it like change like what you've learned at this company? Does it change what you think about what's coming after Transformers?
The constraints are very different for video models and LLMs. Yeah, you never really think about storage costs when you're working in the text space because text is cheap. You can store, you know, like incredible amounts of text and just not take up that much space. But video is expensive, right? And so you're in the video space, you're like long context by default. So you're doing like 100,000 tokens. You're training at 100,000 tokens, and that's not the case for LLMs, where you start out at shorter context lengths and maybe even ramp up or interleave a few long context sequences every now and then. Yeah, like the constraints are very different for video models, and many of the learnings and like some patterns that I saw in diffusion models is also they're also different from LLMs. Some things that don't work as much Like some things don't work in LLMs as well as they do for diffusion, even though conceptually like they seem similar. And on the architecture side, I I would just say that inductive biases are not dead. I'm very much against the arguments that scaling is all you need. So yeah, that's that. I'll leave it at that. Saying inductive biases are not dead. I think people should really ruminate on that. Whoever's building, this is not advice, but I think this is just how the field started out, and it'll continue to be so.
I'm curious also to know about the move into biotech. So you did your undergraduate in India and then you decided to go into like biotech and you're working on, I believe, peptide design there. And then does
Yeah.
that translate into the similarities or differences maybe you're seeing between maybe biological systems and artificial intelligence as well? What was the key motivator there? Because you've spoken a couple of times about how you'd like to return to the field as well. So, what was the primary draw for you there?
In some sense, it feels more fundamental to be understanding biological systems. And yeah, I don't know if I should say that it is more fundamental, but at the time I definitely felt that way. And the problems were incredibly difficult, like I said. Like the take home assignment, I'll just give you a gist of that. I think, I was given 50 sequences, around 50 sequences. And each sequence was around maybe 10 characters long, where each character is an amino acid. And it had a potency score. Each sequence had an associated potency score. And you can imagine that maybe each sequence is basically like a peptide or a drug, and the potency number is telling you how good that drug is. And the task was to understand the mechanism that is producing these potency numbers and basically come up with a bunch of hypotheses for why we are seeing the patterns that we do. And because the data is so sparse, because you only have 50 sequences, what sequences, one of the questions was, if you had to pick 5 sequences, like 5 new sequences, what would those sequences be? And you have to pick them in such a way that it would inform your understanding of the underlying system as much as possible. So this is kind of like, you can frame it as an active learning problem and say, okay, what are the 5 sequences that would be most useful for my predictor to know the ground truth for, so that you can get like a really good sense of, okay, what are the mechanics? Maybe at the first amino acid at position 1 should be this, otherwise it doesn't work. So you can come up with a bunch of hypotheses like that and build different models, build different predictors, and see, maybe ensemble them and see like where the failure modes are, or even just do like bigram models or trigram models or like n-gram models basically, and see, oh, maybe there are like second order effects here, and try to capture dependencies that way. But that assignment spoke to some of the challenges in biotech. First is the data is very sparse. So you need to be really careful about what data to ask for. If there was a lab that can give you that data, you know, and the data is expensive. Depending on the target that you're going for, getting maybe 150 sequences, data for 150 sequences can be, I don't know, it can be like as high as $150,000. So data cost can be high. And even your gold standard, which comes from labs, that is not really a gold standard because labs can be noisy and they can have issues with how they run experiments, and your data can be corrupted. There's huge variance between the same, like between replications of the same experiment. And all of this just building towards, how do I build a drug that works and that solves a particular issue? And and it's not just a question of how to design that drug, it's also a question of what to design for in the first place. Like how do you know which protein to target in the body? How do you know the mechanism that's manifesting as this disease? So from the very beginning phases of trying to understand a disease to building a cure for it, it's incredibly difficult because you have poor observability all around, high noise environments, super high turnaround times. It can take months to get lab results, and to ship a drug to, prod, which is like, I guess, pharmacies. It can take as long as like 7 years, 10 years with $1 billion, a single drug. So the whole field is just insanely difficult, and that's one of the reasons. it's it drew me uh, to biotech. Yeah, but it's also one of the reasons that drove me away because it's like incredibly hard. You need so much capital. You need really good partnerships, and then it can be really demotivating at times because you don't know whether you're doing the right thing or you're just like making assumptions and you just keep going in the dark, hoping that it'll pan out.
You did mention though that it was biotech initially that was the thing that I guess essentially brought you into Toronto, right?
Yeah,
In the past like couple of years that you've been here,
yeah,
Toronto's like tech and AI scene, I guess, has really developed quite a bit. You know, you've been at Cohere, you've been connected to I guess like the Vector Institute ecosystem.
yeah.
What has it been like watching the city evolve and grow into like one of the global AI hubs that it is now, while you're actively like contributing towards that change itself?
I mean, a part of the reason I wanted to come to Toronto, I mean, for me, coming to Toronto was like a dream that realized because I had an offer from a biotech company. It wasn't the other way around, where like I got an offer and then I ended up in Toronto, and then I discovered, oh, wow, Toronto is great. Like I said, I had been like collaborating with Aiden and Ivan since 2017, and around that time, I mean, they were at U of T, at least Aiden was, and they would connect me with professors because we were working on like a research project, and then I would go look up those professors and then see like, oh, they have really interesting work. And at the time, adversarial attacks were a big thing, sparsity was a big thing, and still is, I guess. Uh, so all of these research topics that I resonated with, work was actively being done at U of T. And even reading about the history of neural nets when I first got into I mean, Hinton's name popped up, obviously. So he's from U of T. So there are a whole bunch of connections, and uh, even the deep learning book that I learned from, uh, with Ian Goodfellow and Kurville, and all of them have associations with U of T, like studied at U of T or like in Montreal nearby. So I knew that this was the place to be, even in 2017 or 18. That okay, Toronto is the place where AI innovations happen. I have to go there. And if anything, I'll say that Toronto's status as like an AI innovation leader has gone down since then. Uh, Companies are doing really good things. New companies show up, but I think this is also a little bit because of how research has shifted from being in like academia to like industry research labs, especially for the technology that's vastly impactful, like LLMs or diffusion, all of that. You need capital, and capital industry has capital. Yeah, I think the big ideas and the big bold bets are not as frequent as they used to be. Uh, yeah, so I don't know if I don't know if I'll say that I still think Toronto is the global AI hub. I love to be like I love being in Toronto. I want it to, you know, be the absolute best version of itself. But yeah,
So we talked about your move from India to Toronto first, and now this is interesting. A topic you brought up is something we talk a lot about on the podcast as well. Basically, the culture of risk taking in Toronto or Canada in general, not
mhm,
being as strong or as forceful as maybe in the United States. And I'm
right.
curious to see what your how your perspective on the tech and the work evolved coming from India to Toronto first, and now that you're here and seeing the distinction maybe in the risk taking or in the boldness between Toronto and cities in the United States. Has that been a big jump? Where do you see that going?
Yeah, I mean, I said AI, like I don't think Toronto is the global AI leader, but at the same time, I mean, I do see a lot of projects that go towards supporting entrepreneurs or like new ideas. Like Radical is one of the biggest AI VC firms in the world, and they're based out of Toronto, and they I think almost exclusively fund Canadian companies and Canadian founders. And having that kind of, I mean, they had a start in Canada as well with Layer 6 and TD Bank. So having those ventures exist is hugely beneficial. And Cohere being here, I think, is it's definitely a big deal. As Cohere, like we could have technically moved to SF, like the headquarters, once the company incorporated and like it was getting investor interest and all of that, could have made SF one of the core hubs, but the founders chose not to and said, okay, we're going to build in Toronto. That's what we're going to do. And so the Cohere headquarters are still in Toronto. I mean, we have offices all. Cohere has offices many places, but I think I really respect that move of choosing to stay in Toronto and choosing to innovate from here and establish hubs elsewhere as well, but the home base is here. So I think ventures like that are hugely beneficial to the local ecosystem. I do feel a little bit hypocritical uh, talking about risk taking and judging the Canadian way of like I guess not taking big bets because I'm also kind of a risk averse person. I'm trying not to be, but like it is really hard to take risks, and the founder life is really not easy. So when I'm also not a big fan of this founder culture. Oh, if you're not sure what you want to do, just go be a founder. I think you're just signing up for a lot of pain if you're a founder. You just quite don't realize, I guess, when you're trying to do it because you're caught up in the excitement in the moment. But like if you're serious about it and you're not doing founder as like a lifestyle thing, uh, it is quite difficult. I've seen many founders. I mean, Cohere's founders and like basically every other company that I've worked at or like interacted with. It is quite difficult and it is quite a lot to ask of someone to take that path and to take that path seriously. So yeah, I understand the reluctance to do it, but I'm glad that these ventures are coming up and they're slowly on the upward trend of like, okay, if you fail, that's not a big deal. We'll have like a safety net for you. And I think that makes a big difference. And I think people have talked about this as well of like risk taking as a cultural thing. Like the status of the founder is like, I mean, now it's changing where like people like, oh, wow, you have your own company, that's cool. But for the average founder, I don't think that's a reason to do it, like to be chasing founder status or anything. Yeah, I'm going off track here, but yeah.
No, I think that's still very cool. Talking about just like still on the topic of Toronto culture, um, the first like memory I have of like meeting you was because I attended an event at Youthful Vengeance,
Hmm.
which is I guess the cafe that you are like a part owner of. I
Yeah,
assume.
yeah.
Yeah. Could you tell us a bit more about that? Because I find it so interesting that somebody who is as technical as you
Hmm.
just happens to have, I guess, like a cafe in downtown Toronto, which is so
Yeah,
like out of the blue.
yeah. It's a cafe and an art gallery. But
Wow.
yeah, so when I moved to Canada, I had to find a place to live, right? So this was actually done in India. I went on Kijiji because that's the only website that I knew had Canadian classifieds or whatever. So I didn't even think of checking Facebook or Facebook Marketplace or anything. But I went on Kijiji, saw an ad for like, oh, I'm looking for a roommate. So I hopped on a call with this guy, David, and we chat for 5 minutes. That's all. He just shows me like his place quickly. It was 3 bedrooms, and he was like, "Okay, you seem like a cool dude. Move in." And I was still in India, right? I was like, "Okay, I guess that's it." That could have easily been a scam, uh, but luckily, and I even sent like $2,000 uh, by asking a relative in Canada for a favor. But anyway, that ended up not being a scam. So I moved to the first day, like I land in Toronto, and I go to City Place, which is where I lived for a long time, and I go to this place, and then he's there, and I had this other roommate, Gurbani, who was an actor at the time. He still is an actor. Uh, so I just started living with these guys, right? Like a big cultural shock having grown up in India, and then now I'm living with David, who works in fashion, and he like manages a fashion studio and does like did interesting things in his life. And the other guy's an actor, very very different from me, and I think and then I ended up living with David for like 5 years. The actor guy Gurbani moved to Vancouver, but like over the course of 5 years, I've seen how hardworking David is. Like even through my startup grind, I've never seen someone work as hard as David does for something that he cares about. Like he really puts everything into what he's passionate about and what he's invested in at the time. So yeah, he had a comic book and he used to go to Young and Dundas Square to just like sell his comic book. Just like set up a stall, have some comic books. And Young and Dundas has some crazy people. So yeah, one woman tried to steal his comic books. Uh, Someone tried to fight him. It's like all kinds of crazy stuff. But he has a lot of perseverance uh, for the things that he does. And then he's talked a lot about like doing starting his own business in the arts field somehow, like in in whatever form. So initially it was a fashion studio, and then it turned into, okay, let's do a gallery and a cafe. And and I was just like, sure, I'll help you out. And so I just, you know, gave some capital, and I helped with some programming early on, and I'm still very involved. But that's how it came to be. Like I knew if I if I had to pick one person to invest in Toronto, it would be him. And I mean, no one starts a cafe and an art gallery to be a millionaire. So it wasn't with the interest of, oh, let's get rich. But I definitely believed that Toronto could use more third spaces, like quality third spaces, where the people that run them really care about what they do and how they do it. And David's absolutely like one of them.
It's really interesting you mentioned this concept of third spaces because it's a theme that I've seen come up again and again, especially in this past year.
Mhm.
What do you think is the driving force behind this desire for third spaces that's just like unanimously coming up?
Um, I've had some personal experiences with this. Like, I think Toronto can be a very like transitory city. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correctly, but like you have a lot of like immigrants coming in, and to truly blend into the Canadian population, you need to interact with like people from different backgrounds. And for me, that was like perhaps unintentionally just talking to David and Gurbani. Like David's Korean, Gurbani is white, and then like this guy's like an actor, and this guy's in fashion. So very, very different backgrounds, not just like ethnicity wise, but also like what they do for work. And that kind of like showed me an entirely different view of the world, because I started like they just started tagging me along with wherever they went to. Like I met their friends, we went to parties with them. So that kind of openness was what made me feel like I belong in Toronto. I really want everyone to have that feeling. And it's not easy. Like when I moved here, I had no friends or family. And especially like when you don't move here to study, because when you move here to study, you have classmates and you slowly build friendships through that. But if you don't move here to study and you're just moving here to work, which a lot of people do, it can be really hard to break into new social circles and make friends that you consistently hang out with, not just like, you know, oh, let's set a meeting 2 weeks from now and hang out for a coffee. So I think to have that level of consistency, you need somewhere to be. So and that is a third space where like you and a set of other people just hang out at the same space, and just through that you kind of build friendships. And for a city like Toronto, which is quite unique, I think it's like I really believe it's like the most diverse city in the world. And yeah, for a city like Toronto, you really need those third spaces to exist and thrive, to draw different people in, to draw people from different backgrounds in, and then somehow make interactions happen so that everyone here feels like they belong here. And that's how you kind of like, assimilate into the culture.
When you were talking earlier about founder life being very difficult and just, in some ways being a world of pain as well, in my head, I'm
Yeah.
thinking of, someone who's written a project, produced it, directing it, and is just trying to get a crew together to kind of believe in this vision. Do you
Mhm.
find this sort of like a creative blurring of the lines even in your technical work when you're trying to problem solve, because filmmaking and like working on ML projects, you're problem solving of
Mhm.
course, but the domains are very different, right? Do you
Yeah,
find any blending between those in your own like creative processes or your thinking?
like similarities in how I approach machine learning tasks and creative stuff. Um, it's a bit more different than I would like. For ML stuff, I've largely been self-driven, where I see an issue and I go fix that. And for certain hobbies, like I guess filmmaking, it is a very social thing. Like you need people to help you make films. There are limits on how much and what kind of films you can make with just yourself. You know, you put a camera somewhere and you make something happen in front of it. So I think by nature, I mean, depending on the stories you tell, it is by nature that you need to work with different people, and it's not a bad thing. I think that's a great thing about filmmaking, that you just get to go work with people that care about this craft. It's not a particularly well paid uh, job or an endeavor, but people do it because they like it. So my experience has been that they're a little different. Yeah, I mean, I can probably draw some analogies between working in startups and like in tight uh, like communities. Startup is like a tight community. Like you know everyone very well. They're basically your friends, and you're building together with a bunch of friends, which is basically what filmmaking is. And and when you're trying to do a hard thing, whether that's a startup or a different like a big company, it can be challenging and demoralizing because the solution's not always obvious and you're trying to persist. And I always find that that's when I'm most creative, because I leave the day kind of like feeling exhausted and maybe even worried that okay, like how do I fix this? How do I solve this thing? Um, and that really turns into like an outlet for writing stories, because suddenly I'm able to draw analogies between what I'm experiencing and what someone could be experiencing that's from a completely different walk of life. Uh, so there are some similarities in like the team dynamics, of course, but for me, the connection between them is more through has been so far through one feeding the other.
I think a big parallel, like you were saying, through team dynamics could also be with directors, or if you're leading a startup or a project, trying to get people to buy into this vision that so far has only been in your head, and making sure they have faith in you to be able to
Yes.
verify whether or not what's coming to life is what was intended.
Hmm.
I think that's like
Hmm.
a core part of whether or not something actually works and thrives in the long run.
For sure, yeah. Like I haven't directed a film with a big crew or like any crew. The biggest crew that I've worked with and like I directed something is like three people, which was like two friends from Cohere and me, just with like a mirrorless. But I've worked in bigger sets where I wasn't the writer or director, but I just thought the script was cool. And I was just like a production assistant on these sets. I would just go and for some, I was just like behind the scenes photographer. And it is, yeah, it is cool to be like on set with people and we're just talking about the script. And we're all geeking out. And it's fun to watch that realize. I mean, this is also, in saying that, like, I feel like, yeah, I've heard so many stories about filmmaking and on-set experience uh, that I'm kind of maybe romanticizing a little bit because I'm approaching it as a hobbyist, and people that do it for a living have had horrible experiences. um, but I do think, yeah, there are parallels, and when it works really well, and you make really good friends.
One thing I want to ask you about before we head on to the last section is you've I've seen this phrase occur across your socials multiple times, but you've mentioned that change fueled progress, and I guess for most people, they find change uncomfortable or destabilizing. But I want to know what it is about change that energizes you rather than drains you.
There are a lot of lessons I learned in my early life. I think right about my high school was very rough, and that led to like a few years of like being complacent a little bit. And I had this moment, something happened, and I had this moment of like realization where it all came crashing down. I was like, okay, like this is not the way. And that was around the time when I like entered undergrad, and I knew I had to change things. And I think it hasn't always been the case, but for like most of the time, I really try to like push myself, and I it makes me uncomfortable when I'm comfortable. uh, so the biggest reason I also like left Cohere was that I got too comfortable. Like being there for 4 years, building big parts of the like the modeling tech stack. Uh, it gets you, I don't know, like it buys you people's trust. Like everyone in the company trusts you to deliver things and to do something. And for me, I had this thing where like I wasn't pushing myself the way I should have been or like I used to. And there are other reasons as well, but that is honestly like the biggest reason where I was like, I'm not pushing myself. I need to change. And I tried to force that change into myself while working at Cohere. Uh, but I really couldn't. Like I gave it a shot, but I couldn't kind of like inject that into myself. So yeah, I had to make that difficult decision. It's probably the most difficult decisions I've made in my life to be like leaving behind people that I've worked with for like 7 years, and and so many other people that like I'm very close friends with. But since undergrad, I've just like realized that that is the one motto that has like worked out for me. It's not always easy in the moment where I'm like, like I have to push myself, and sometimes I don't feel good, and I can be very inconsistent. And I wouldn't say that I'm very consistent in the pursuits and whatever pursuits I have. But I just know that if I'm like very comfortable in that spot, it's just like the memories of like earlier life where like, okay, this cannot happen again. I have to change things up, learn new skills, whatever it means.
Some interesting things you touched upon there. I think some of our next questions might get into that as well, briefly. But so this is a segment we like to do with all of our guests, and we incorrectly named it rapid fire questions in the beginning, but turns out it's not very rapid. So feel free to take your time with it. That's not an issue.
Okay,
But I'll kick things
cool.
off with, what is your go-to comfort meal after a long workday?
A biryani.
Great shout.
Yeah.
Any like particular variation or
Uh,
just standard?
I'm vegetarian. Uh, and there are a couple of really good biryani spots downtown. There's the Biryani Wala. There is Indraprastha on Baldwin Street, right next to Rooms, I think. Uh, and there's like a South Indian spot on Sherburne. It's called Sarvi. And yeah, biryani from any of these spots is like, it's too often a comfort meal, but it is my comfort
Thanks for that. Now I know what I'm having for dinner today. Thank you.
meal. Okay.
Okay. Would you rather spend a day at the cabin in the woods coding by yourself or writing poetry and like, singing covers of songs?
The latter.
The latter?
Yeah.
Okay. Any particular song or just in general?
Some Bollywood. Like I love singing Bollywood, so I'll probably just sing that.
Nice. Okay. What is the most random thing you've ever built just for fun? Or it could be a work related project as well. But what's the most random thing you've ever built?
Most random thing. Like all the things I've built were with a purpose. And I don't like that. I mean, like I built like an amino acid visualizer because I saw like at Protein Care, people would just like constantly switch softwares to just visualize a peptide and maybe like, so I just like built like a Slack bot an evening where I just like wrote a CLI interface for like, I forget what software that was, but to like render like a peptide with like an arbitrary amino acid sequence. And I just built that. It wasn't hard to build, but when you say random, that comes to mind.
That's a lot more technical than what I was expecting.
Okay.
um, okay, if you could have dinner with anybody, dead or alive, one on one, who would it be?
Um, Richard Hamming. Yeah. Um, Probably that. Like I read his book, The Art of Doing Science and Engineering. It's by Stripe Press. Yeah, so inspiring, and then very practical as well. Technical, practical. It's everything. And I think it would be really fun to just talk to him about how he went about his career and in life in general. Because when you get like in that book, it's mostly like a technical things that he has done in his life. But I really want to know what his personal life was like. If he always had that conviction and what he wanted to do and how he wanted to do it.
Okay, what is your go-to tech tool or gadget that you just can't live without, but you really should be able to?
Um, this was a very recent development, but Kinopia, I love Kinopia. It's like if you were at New Demos, it was demoed there, New Demos too. It's like a thinking canvas. I think you can just go to the URL, kinopio.club, KINIPIO. Yeah, it's very quirky, but it's exactly what I needed. And it showed up right at a great time.
Oh, is that the thing you used to build your personal website?
Yeah, that's the
Is
one.
oh, that's why it sounded familiar. Sticking on this theme of apps and tools, what is one app or tool that you think is totally underrated?
Kinopio.
You know what? Valid answer.
Okay, if you could instantly master one skill overnight, what would it be?
This is like my core life struggle. There are too many things that I want to master overnight. Um, right now, I would just want to master singing because, like, I'm just coming from a singing class where I got like blasted for not being on pitch. So I think it would be pretty nice to have like really good control over my vocals.
That's pretty cool. If you could go back and give yourself any advice when you were just starting your tech career, what would you say to yourself?
Don't chase popularity. Yeah, I think it's panned out very well so far. Uh, because when I was an undergrad, like web dev was the biggest thing, and machine learning was like an undercurrent. But when I first started learning it, it made sense. Uh, it gave me a purpose to really appreciate math, which is perhaps overdue. But yeah, like I did the even startups, joining a startup like as my first job in India, it wasn't like a big deal. Like, oh, you're not joining Microsoft or Amazon, Google. So I think I optimized for interestingness a little bit unintentionally, definitely, just because I can only do that's my weakness as well. Like I can only do what I really like, uh, and that has panned out so far. We'll see how it continues to do, but so far it's been fine, and that is the advice I'll stick to.
That's a great answer. If your life was a movie, what would it be titled?
Burning, yeah. I mean, yeah, it's very inspired by the Korean film Burning, and I think I would want a movie, yeah, about my life the same way.
Fair enough. Fair enough. Okay. Final rapid fire question, probably the most important one out of the bunch.
Mhm.
Cats or dogs?
Dogs, yeah. There is a dog at the cafe. I don't know if you've seen Poppy.
Oh, I think I remember the first
Yeah.
time I was. Do you have a dog right now?
No, I do not. No.
Oh,
She's at the
if
cafe.
you oh I see. If you were to have a dog, like what type of dog would you go for?
I don't know. I love Poppy, uh, but she has a very cat-like personality. I think, okay, what I would go for is a dog with a cat-like personality. I think that's what I would choose, and that's probably like one of the smaller dogs if I were to pick one. But maybe I'll have two dogs, a big one and a small one. I don't know. I'm just going off.
Okay, yeah, and with that, we're coming to a close for this podcast episode. Thank you for coming on this podcast.
Thanks so
Before we
much.
finish this,
Mhm.
do you have any advice or any final thoughts for anybody who's listening?
And final thoughts. Yeah, I feel like I rambled for a lot of the questions. I don't know if I actually answered them, but hopefully that was fun to listen to. And I don't have any advice. Actually, I do have some advice. I've lived by this, and I think, and this is the only piece of advice I think everyone should live by, is that like you should just do what you want to do. I think you should listen to everyone with patience and with an open mind, and then just like think think for yourself about what other people said and honestly consider them. And if it's not what you want, just do what you want. But listen to everyone. Yeah. Like I don't want this to come across as like, okay, you should do what you want as something like arrogant. But yeah, you don't want to live with any regrets. You should go by your own conviction. And if you fail, that's because of you. If you win, that's because of you.
Great advice. Okay, and with that, thank you for coming on Not a Minimum Viable podcast, and thank you to anybody who's listening.